And I'm now recording our talk, so that's up and running. And let me open in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this amazing technology that allows us to communicate in spite of a pandemic that is forcing most of us to be in our homes. And Father, I pray that you would help me to present this content in a way that people can understand it. And also, Father, that this would be something that would bring you glory and honor, and help us, Lord, to be loving and respectful to one another as we dialogue with one another. And thank you for the dialogue feature we have. I pray to your blessings upon our co-hosts, Mark Perez and Ross Hoagland. And thank you too for the availability of Buzz Rana. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, with that, I'm going to share my screen with all of you. And you should now be seeing my first slide. And it simply indicates all the ways you can communicate with our scholar team at Reasons to Believe. All of our scholars have a Facebook and a Twitter page. If you don't get to ask your question today, you can try asking your questions. We get to almost every question that we get on our Facebook and Twitter pages. And yes, every day we're putting up new video clips, video recordings on our 24/7 YouTube channel. So take advantage of that. And a couple of books that will give you more content we've been talking about. This is a book that Fuzron and I wrote, Who is Adam? And you can get a free chapter of that book by going to reasons.org/Rana. And I'm going to be focusing today on the human exceptionalism, and you'll find a couple of chapters on that in Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. And you can get a free chapter of that book at reasons.org/Ross. And if you really want to get into the technical details and see how our human origins model fares when it's being critiqued by atheist scholars and theistic evolutionary scholars, you can watch the recordings of our all-day workshop on the human origins. And you can get that at reasons.org/Human Origins Workshop 2020. And particularly you can see Fazal Rana presenting our Reasons to Believe Human Origins model and how that stands up to critique from top atheists and theistic evolutionary scholars. So those are for those of you who want to get into the more technical details. Now I'm going to begin this message first by quickly reviewing what the Bible claims about the origin of humanity. And it repeatedly makes three specific claims: that we human beings are the product of special creation. We're not the result of some long naturalistic process of evolution from previous life forms. God steps in, as it says in Genesis chapter 2, and miraculously creates both Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And he places within us something that no other species of life on planet Earth possesses, and that is the image of God. And so we alone, for example, ask the God question. We alone have the capacity to discover God and form a relationship with God. And the image of God includes many other features as well. But this is the whole point that we're making, is that from a biblical perspective, we see that we human beings are unique and that we have capabilities and attributes that no other life form on planet Earth shares. And as I've mentioned previously, this is now under considerable attack from theistic evolutionists and especially from atheists who are trying to claim we human beings only differ by degree, not fundamentally in kind with other life forms, and in particular that we human beings are the product of a natural descent from a common ancestor with the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and ultimately the chimpanzees and the orangutans. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is some of the research, just some, not all, of the research we've been developing at Reasons to Believe that basically establishes the biblical claims and responds to the claims coming from atheists, anthropologists, and those that take a theistic evolutionary perspective. And we've covered this before. You'll find recordings at reasons.org. So I'm simply going to list this. I'm not going to go into any explanation here because we've covered this in a previous paradoxes.org recording. But very quickly, what distinguishes us human beings from all other animals on the face of the earth, we alone have the capacity for symbolic expression. We alone have the ability to invent and manipulate symbols, to develop an alphabet, a number system, equations, for example. We have the ability to invent and manufacture complex tools, the capacity for explosive technological advance, the ability to manufacture and wear clothes, the ability to invent and use complex languages and multiple languages, not just one, the capacity to form complex social structures like cities and nations, the ability to invent and use complex trading and transportation systems, the ability to engage in mathematics, literature, music, art, philosophy, theology, and the ability to tame, domesticate, and train nefesh animals. We alone of all the animals on the face of the earth have the capability of domesticating and training non-human animals to serve and please us. So this is a unique feature of we human beings. And I think it was about 3 weeks ago, you'll find a recording where I went into this in some detail. And then this is also a review how we spent some time talking about how we not only have exceptional capabilities and capacities, our body structure is unique. And so this lists some of the unique features of human bodies, that we have a skull shape that's different from, I mean, it's a large skull, but it also is shaped in a globular way with lots of room for a large parietal lobe. And that's a unique feature. We human beings have the largest parietal lobe of any species of life on planet Earth. We have hand dexterity that enables us, for example, to type 100 words on a computer or to play a Liszt piano concerto. A long infant adolescent development time. It literally takes 24 years for a female to fully develop, a human female to fully develop from the time she is born to when she's fully capable. And for human males, it's 25 years. Men need a little longer, apparently. We have a high metabolic rate, which means we're able to experience about 4 times as many heartbeats in a typical human lifespan as you would get for any other animal species, and we're able to live for several decades. And a few other features that are unique to our bodies, a high encephalization quotient, which means we have a high percentage of our brain mass relative to our body mass. And then we have a high leg to height ratio. We have a slender skeletal frame, very little body hair, we're referred to as a naked ape, and a very efficient body cooling system, referring to our perspiration system. And basically, these are all features that allow us to actually have this large brain with a large parietal lobe, and yet keep it cool enough that it doesn't get damaged over several decades. Where we have this skeletal frame, little body hair, this perspiration system that allows us to keep our body cool in the midst of high heat and high humidity. And our creator basically realizing that we can manufacture and wear clothes. So going into a cold region is no problem. They wanted to ensure that we could handle a hot humid climate. That's something that's unique to us human beings. We have the morphology and the skills and capabilities to be able to live in any climate zone on the face of the earth. And that's unique to us amongst large animals on the face of the earth. And this is something I'm going to have Fuzz comment on. He's our biochemist, but he's actually written extensively on how when you look at the genes of humans and compare them with Neanderthals and Denisovans, you see several unique features that establishes that we're not the product of common genetic descent with a common ancestor with the Neanderthals. And you can ask him questions on that feature. And I also would recommend an article he's written on our reasons.org website titled New Pseudonym Gene Function, Smiles on the Case for Creation. It was posted on April 1st. Excellent article. I really enjoyed it. But what we covered last week was a research paper that's been published, and it was published just literally a couple of weeks ago, basically making the claim It was in Nature Scientific Reports, making the claim that Neanderthals had the capability of weaving fibers to make complex strings. And this actually shows you an image of the string that was discovered. And you can see it's just a very tiny piece of string. We're talking about 4 millimeters. And the weave part that you see in the lower right is just a single millimeter. And here you get to see a little clearer image of these fibers and the weave there in the lower right. And this is a diagram that was in the published paper making the point that where you see that Z, this is where they can see a triple weave. And the fact that they found this very short triple weave, they claim, establishes that Neanderthals are capable, even mathematically capable, like was we human beings. And I'm going to share with you a couple of quotes from the paper. Here's the paper's Scientific Reports, Volume 10. The lead author was a scientist by the name of Hardy. And what they write in this paper, understanding the use of twisted fibers implies the use of complex multi-component technologies, as well as understanding of pairs, sets, and numbers. In other words, they're claiming that Neanderthals must have had some special manufactured tools to be able to make this complex weave, and this indicates that they had high mathematical understanding and knew the concepts of pairs and sets and numbers. And then they also went on to make the point in their conclusion that the idea that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans is becoming increasingly untenable. And so they're basically trying to argue that Neanderthals are just as functional and capable at all levels of intellectual understanding and dexterity as we human beings. And this was, of course, picked up by a number of popular web articles that are found on the internet. This is why both Buzz and I have responded to this discovery. It's gotten a lot of attention. In fact, I developed this message as a direct result of people on my Facebook and Twitter page saying, can you please respond to this? So both Fazal Rana and myself have made a response. And kind of what you see in the web articles and in the popular news reports of this discovery, and I apologize for the misspelling of skills, that the world's oldest yarn hints that Neanderthals had basic math skills. And this is kind of the bottom line of the claim. Now, this is quite different from the human origins model that we propose or espouse at Reasons to Believe. We put Neanderthals in the same category as the great apes. We do not consider them to be human. They are primates. They had bipedal capabilities. They were very skilled hunters, but they hunted with very simple weapons, basically spears, just like chimpanzees do. And so we stand by our claim that humans and only humans have the image of God and possess these complex intellectual capabilities. And so it's been important for us to respond. And having carefully read the research paper, one response and incidentally, I've had an opportunity to talk about this in detail with Fuz Rana. You're going to have the opportunity to hear from him and to pose questions to him later on in this broadcast. But they found this little tiny piece of string at level 4.2 in a region of southwestern France. And so this is a site, and they found this string there, and they found 3 other artifacts at the same level. So because the string was so tiny, they were not able to date the string. They would have had to destroy the string to do so. And so what they did is they dated 3 other artifacts that were found at the same level as the string. And they dated these 3 artifacts with 2 methods, electron spin resonance dating and uranium thorium dating. And I'll explain briefly how those methods work. But what they published in their paper is they came up with 3 dates for these artifacts: 41,000 years ago, 46,000 years ago, and 52,000 years ago. And the errors that you see there, 42 plus or minus 2, 46 plus or minus 5, and 52 plus or minus 2,000 years. Those are the statistical errors, or what scientists call the random errors. It does not include the systematic errors. And that's important. I'm going to explain these systematic effects in a minute. But one major assumption they're making, of course, is that the string, because it's at the same level, has the same date as these other three artifacts found at the same level. That may or may not be the case. It's easy to imagine scenarios where an artifact would wind up at a level where it doesn't have the same date as other artifacts at that level. So that's one systematic effect. But I want to deal with, I think, our more major systematic issues with this particular string. And first, I'm going to look at electron spin resonance. And this is a dating method that's akin to optical luminescence and thermal luminescence. Specifically, the scientist here is measuring the amount of unpaired electrons that have been previously exposed to natural radiation. And for this method to be able to give you a date that you can trust, you need to know the past natural radiation rates to get the sample age. And often what is assumed is that the radiation we see today has been constant all the way through past time. That may or may not be the case. And that's why I put down rates plural, because we would anticipate that the natural radiation rates would not be constant. And so to really have a knowledge of the true date, you need to know those rates, and typically those rates are not known at all, which means that the dates that you have could skew significantly up or down from the quoted date. And now the uranium-thorium dating method is a little more complicated. This is not a radiometric dating method. I want to make that very clear. It's not like carbon-14 dating or uranium-238 dating. What this method does, it measures how long ago a sample has been precipitated from water. And how this method works is thorium is not soluble in water, but uranium is. However, uranium-234 decays into thorium-230. So the principle here is after a certain period of time, thorium would show up in the sample because of the decay of uranium-234. And explicitly what's going on here is that you're determining the ratio of thorium-230 to uranium-234 in a sample. And that yields the correct age if and only if one knows the sample is entirely from a single rapid precipitation event and the sample subsequently has not been disturbed. And of course, this may not be the case. And if that's not the case, then the date that you got could be way off, either up or down from the claimed date. Now, even if we assume, so for example, the dates could prove to be much younger than the 41 and 46,000 years that were published in the paper, in which case, and what the paper is basically saying is that this date of 41, 46, 50,000 years ago is sufficiently far back in time that eliminates the possibility that humans could have been responsible for weaving this small piece of string. And because they're basically making the point that humans were not present in southwestern France until about 40,000 years ago. Now, when we look at the date, one of the dates, again, this is assuming no systematic errors in the date, that the date is actually accurate, 41 plus or minus 2,000 years. But both Fuzz and I would make the point as we read the scientific literature of when humans entered southern France, a date of 41,000 plus or minus 2,000 years ago does not rule out that modern humans were responsible for this particular part of string. And there's actually some evidence that tells us it would rule out Neanderthals because it's still an open question exactly when Neanderthals went extinct, and in particular when they went extinct in France. And there is research indicating that by that time, 41,000 years ago, they were already extinct in France, in which case it could not have been responsible for the string, which opens up the possibility that, hey, this sophisticated weave we see here may actually be done by human beings. But humans aren't the only possible alternate explanation for who made this string. I mean, any of you who've watched birds make a nest or have actually recovered a bird nest, you'll discover that birds actually possess the brain structure. It's something we see incidentally. There's a 3-compartment brain, internal brain structure for the human brain. We don't see that in the great apes that share the planet with us today, like the orangutans and chimpanzees, but we do see it in a number of bird species. And it's that particular structure that gives them the capability of having very high eye-beak coordination. And another thing we notice about some bird species, they got very good close-up vision. So they got high acuity close-up vision, very good eye-beak coordination, and this enables them to do amazing things with their beaks, and they can actually weave fibers, and that's been witnessed by many of us, very complex weaving that they're capable of doing. And so if birds can do this, and humans can do this, but when we look at Neanderthals and look at their brain structure, it appears that they lack the brain structure that would give them the necessary eye-hand coordination to make complex weaves. Although something as short as this, and this I think is something that's worth looking at, is that the weave that we see here, we're only looking at about 1 millimeter of these 3 fibers being woven together. The weaves in this particular string may not even be made by an animal at all. Entropy may have done it, in the sense that when you have a jumbled up mess of fibers, they tend to entangle in ways that can produce what looks to be a complex manufactured weave. I mean, I think many of us have had that experience with fishing line, for example. You get several pieces of fishing line, put them in a box, you pull them out of the box, and yeah, it's woven together. Just shaking of the box. Basically, the principles of thermodynamics are capable by accident of making what looks like complex weave structures. And of course, as you already mentioned, a bird may have woven the string, and given the date, it's quite possible that a human being in that part of France may have woven the string. And this is significant because the paper is basically saying there is no other alternative for explaining this string except that Neanderthals done it. But these are 3 alternatives. There may be more, but these are 3 alternatives, excuse me, to explain the complex weave structure that we do. And what's interesting too is that when we look at the weaving capability of birds, we really don't attribute any mathematical understanding to the weave's accomplishment of birds. The fact that we would claim that they understand set theory or number theory, you really don't need that to make these kinds of weaves. And so that I found problematic with the paper, just because they saw there's 1 millimeter of a weave. And I think that's important too. The whole string wasn't woven this way. Just one tiny piece of the string had that weave. And you know, why are we attributing mathematical understanding to this? And so if this was done by Neanderthals, why would that necessarily indicate any sophisticated mathematical understanding? Birds don't do calculus. Birds haven't developed a number system. They don't do things like 5 + 8 = 13. Now, my colleague that I'm going to bring on in a few minutes, he did a Facebook Live on April 21st, and that is up on YouTube. You can watch it. From his perspective, he also, I think it was about a 30-minute talk he did in YouTube Live, and it's titled, "Did Neanderthals Invent String?" In fact, that's all you got to do. Go to YouTube and put in, "Did Neanderthals Invent String?" It'll pop right up, and you can watch that. Now, in the book we're bringing on evolution, Again, Fuzz Rana and Anjanette Roberts, and the anthropologist that we recruited for writing the book. She passed away while she was on her way here from South Africa to join our staff. Sue Dykes, she has a chapter in that book where she goes into all the claims made in the scientific literature that Neanderthals were capable of advanced technology and had all the intellectual and dexterity features of we human beings. And she goes through the scientific literature and basically makes the point that this is all the result of researchers reading into data things that are, just what they want to see from things that have very slender evidence in support of it. And this is something that I'll be covering next week, is looking at the claims in the scientific literature that Neanderthals bury their dead and were engaged in sophisticated worship services when they're burying their dead, had control of fiber, they were musicians, capable of manufacturing complex musical instruments, had developed advanced tools, had symbolic capability. However, as we dig into other research papers, we discover that there's no evidence they wore clothes. In fact, there's very good evidence that they had not developed clothing technology and that they did not have technological advance. They were on the face of the earth for a lot longer than us human beings have ever been here, and we don't see that. No evidence they constructed dwellings or towns or cities. No evidence they tamed animals. No evidence for symbolic capability. So we'll be looking into that. But again, if you really want the details on that, you're going to find this excellent chapter written by Sue Dykes in the book we're bringing out in Evolution. And I think Fuzz will be able to give you a date for when that book is going to be released. I'm hoping it'll be in the next couple of months that we will see that. And again, I can recommend that you get this book, Who is Adam? It's now in a second edition. We did a 10-year update, and you can peruse a free chapter of that book at reasons.org/Ross. And likewise, you can get a free chapter of the book where I compared the exceptionalism of the birds and mammals relative to all of their life and the exceptionalism of us human beings relative to the birds and mammals. You can get a free chapter at Hidden Treasures in the book of Job. And for those of you who want to dive into the technical details, highly recommend the recordings we made of this all-day workshop on human origins. And so, bottom line conclusion, the more we learn from the record of nature, the more reasons we gain to believe that we human beings are God's special creation, just like the Bible declared thousands of years ago. And I think this is another indication that the more we learn about science, the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we get that the Bible thousands of years ago had correctly predicted these future scientific discoveries. With that, I'm going to have either Mark or Ross, let me stop share here and bring things back where we can. Okay, so if we can have Mark or Ross promote Fuzz Rana for being an attendee to being a panelist, then we'll be able to hear from him.
I think I know how to do that. Let's.
If not, I can help you.
I need to find his name in the list.
Yeah, you have to go down the attendee list, find his name. There you go.
That's what I'm.
Okay, then we need to.
Ross, I think I just did it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, Fuzz.
Hi, Hugh.
Yes, Fuzz is in there.
And
All
everyone.
Okay, Fuzz, I don't know whether you caught the pieces where I was promoting some of the things that you've done.
Yeah, I did. Thanks.
Okay. Well, what I'd like you to do in particular is to say a few words about the evidence we have for the genetic distinctiveness of we human beings relative to Neanderthals. And then I'd love to hear your comments on the biochemistry in this article about the string. So if you could make a few comments on that, then I want to allow our attendees to pose questions to you.
Sure, sure. Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for having me. And I caught a good portion of what you presented. I joined a little bit after 11, so I caught a good portion of what you presented. And, I think, your question about, the distinctives between humans and Neanderthals is really very important to bring to bear, when we, look at these kinds of discoveries, because, while we've sequenced, and have high quality genomes available for Neanderthals, comparisons of the Neanderthal genomes and human genomes with an eye towards what makes us distinct from Neanderthals or Neanderthals distinct from us does show significant differences in genes that are typically involved in neural development and cognitive activities. And this includes not only differences in the gene sequences, but people are doing some pretty sophisticated work where they're able to infer differences in gene expression patterns. And again, those differences in gene expression patterns actually indicate cognitive differences, or lead you to expect cognitive differences. Also, you can estimate the developmental trajectory of Neanderthals and compare that to humans, because we've got enough Neanderthal remains that we can kind of piece together what happens in terms of growth and development from infanthood towards adulthood. And Neanderthals spent very little time in adolescence compared to modern humans. And that's significant because there's a lot of brain development that happens in adolescence that Neanderthals simply forwent, I guess. And then on top of that, there's really good work in comparative brain, comparative neural anatomy between humans and Neanderthals, where humans have a highly unusual skull. Our skull is globular, and our facial features are different than that of Neanderthals. And those two things in conjunction lead to an expansion of certain regions of the brain, particularly the parietal lobe. And so Neanderthals had a smaller, less prominent parietal lobe than modern humans have, than we have. And that's a part of the brain that's critical for mathematical processing, for language processing. It's the part of the brain that's involved in religious experiences. And so that really is highlighting significant differences, so much so that there are a number of anthropologists that argue on the virtue of the brain structure that they highly doubt that Neanderthals could have made art or could have engaged in sophisticated hunting practices. And so that, I think, brings to bear, how you would interpret finds like this, claim of Neanderthals having fiber technology. You could make an argument that they don't seem to biologically have that capability.
Yeah, and Fuzz, is there an estimate? I mean, I mentioned in my presentation that for we humans, it's 24 years for a female to get fully developed from birth and 25 for a male. Is there any indication of what the period of time is for Neanderthals?
Well, wow, that's a really good question. And I don't know the answer precisely, but I'm under the impression that it is in the teenage years that Neanderthals would have reached full maturity. And this is, based on, the way people determine this is based on microanatomical features in the teeth, which just show, different stages of growth and development. And humans clearly have an adolescent stage evident from the tooth anatomy that you don't see in Neanderthals.
Right.
But I don't know the precise age or what the estimates are, but I'm under the impression it's teenage years.
Okay, very good. And can you comment on the biochemistry of the string, the cellulose and the lignin?
Yeah, to me, one of the things that stands out in this study is the composition of the fibers that they actually recovered. And by the way, they recovered a number of fibers from that site. I don't know if you mentioned this, but only one of them actually shows what appears to be that 3-ply weave. And so right away, that suggests to me that maybe this is an outlier of some sort, that there might be an alternative explanation for it. But something else that to me is curious is the work that was done on the analytical characterization of the fibers is top-notch work, by the way, where they did some very nice SEM imaging, which is scanning electron microscopy. But they also used a technique called Fourier transform Raman microspectroscopy, and that's a mouthful. But essentially, it's a technique that allows you to measure vibrational modes in the material that you're analyzing. And with the microspectroscopic technique, you can use a microscope to focus on particular regions of the sample and then record a Raman spectrum, which is a complementary technique to infrared spectroscopy. And both techniques are measuring vibrational modes in molecules. So molecules vibrate. The bonds that form kind of vibrate back and forth, and there's characteristic modes of vibration you see because of quantum mechanics. And you can actually measure these vibrational spectra that tell you what types of functional groups are present, because functional groups are going to vibrate at different wave numbers or different frequencies. And so from that, you can usually do a good identification of a sample from its vibrational spectrum. And so in the spectrum that they recorded, they could actually see bands coming from cellulose, what they call holocellulose, which is a combination of cellulose proper as well as something called hemicellulose. And most wood is going to be composed primarily of cellulose, and the percentage is somewhere between 50 to 90%, whether depending on the hardness of the wood. Softer woods tend to have about 70% cellulose, and harder woods closer to 90%. And then the bulk percentage difference is usually made up by lignin, which is a very complex material that's incredibly durable, that is highly resistant to breakdown. And so when they recorded their spectrum, they saw both cellulose and lignin bands, which is what you would expect, but they saw that the spectrum dominated by cellulose and had minimal lignin contribution. And this is not what you'd expect at all, because when wood breaks down, it's the cellulose component that chemically breaks down first before the lignin. And so usually in fibers that are recovered from archaeological sites, it's primarily dominated with lignin components, where cellulosic components form a minimal component. So the fiber composition doesn't look like you would expect it to look. And the researchers feebly address that issue in their paper, but in my mind, they really almost, I wouldn't say are dismissive of it, but they really don't provide what I think to be a compelling reason to explain why you see that chemical difference or the compositional difference. So to me, that kind of reinforces the notion of maybe this is an outlier, or to interpret this as being a string really doesn't make sense, because the chemical composition isn't what you'd expect. And it's a single sample among a number of specimens they recovered from the site that shows that property. And so to me, I think the best thing to say, this is some kind of outlier that accidentally adopted this appearance of a three-ply structure as opposed to being a bona fide fiber.
And would you also say this may be evidence that indeed the dates have systematics that may quite likely push it to a much younger date?
Yeah, that is definitely a very real possibility that can't be dismissed by any means. Now, one thing that the researchers claim is that this quote unquote string sample was found underneath a flake, right? And so they argue that meant that the flake must have been deposited after the string or coinciding with the string. So that would be the only evidence that you could bring to bear that might challenge, the earlier date for the string. But the fact that you're dealing with, these dating techniques that you're pointing out have concerns about how reliable those dates are, says to me that maybe you should be a little bit hesitant about going to such an extreme interpretation that this is genuinely a Neanderthal technology.
Oh, very good, Fuzz. And I'm going to turn it back to Mark and Ross because there may be some people who've got specific questions to you. I'm going to allow them to ask you questions first, and then I'll be more than happy to take other questions. So Ross, do we have anything set up for Fuzz?
We sure do. Good morning, Fuzz. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Ross.
It's great to have you as part of Paradox. It's too bad it took this to.
Yeah.
First question, I'm going to, just so everybody knows, I'm going to take these questions a bit out of order because some of them are directed at Hugh and some are directed at Fuzz. So I'm going to take the ones for Fuzz first. We have one from Doug McComb. He says, please tell me if experiments along the lines of the Miller-Urey experiments have been done in recent times, and if so, how many amino acids were formed and what were they? Wikipedia is stating that most of the amino acids necessary for life have been observed to have been formed in such controlled experiments.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the total inventory of amino acids that have formed in Miller-Urey type experiments, but I do know that there are a number that actually haven't been formed. Some of the more complex amino acids, for example, like tryptophan as one example. Most origin of life researchers actually think that those amino acids were late appearing when it comes to the origin of life, that they would not have been around in the very initial stages. And so, and there you see origin of life researchers trying to argue that you could actually create proteins with 16 of the 20 canonical amino acids and things like that. And you can find some proteins that don't have the full suite of amino acids, but by and large, to get the biochemical complexity you need for life, you've got to have that full set of 20 amino acids. And so so all that to say is I don't know the full list of components amino acids that have been formed off the top of my head, but I don't think it's near the full set of 20.
Yeah, the number I've read, Fuzz, is that it's 14. 14 have been found, but all the basic amino acids are missing.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, well, I mean, amino acids like arginine or tryptophan, for example, right away come to mind because those have very chemically sophisticated R groups. 14 sounds about right to me, Hugh. That's 14, 16, something like that. And you can make a few proteins with only that set of amino acids, but you can't make everything that you need. There was along these lines, there was a series of studies done by a group headed up by a biochemist named Stephen Freeland. And his team has shown that the 20 set of amino acids that you see in proteins is this really unusual set of amino acids. I mean, in nature, there's literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of amino acids that exist. And so the question is, why this set of 20 amino acids? Because if you look at things like the Murchison, you see some non-biological amino acids, like alpha-butyric acid, for example, that show up that you would think should actually have been incorporated into the set of 20 amino acids if it was a chemical evolutionary origin of life. And yet we don't see that in there. And so people have asked, well, why this set of 20? And it turns out that it forms this really unusual set of amino acids that have the just right set of chemical properties that allow life to be possible. And when they compare that set of 20 with other random sets that are randomly made up in terms of the amino acid composition, none of them have the properties that you would need to be able to sustain life. So it's not only that you might be able to make a protein here or there out of 14 or whatever 16 amino acids, but you really are losing out of the capabilities that you would have to produce functional molecules that would cover the range of operations you need for a cell by virtue of leaving out those, 4 or 6 amino acids, because you've dramatically compromised the chemical optimality of that remaining set. So that study, I think, really, the optimization study really, I think, to me, deals a serious blow to chemical evolution, because it's showing just how important each one of those amino acids is in contributing to the biochemistry of proteins.
Very good. Thank you. This question's from Mark, and I want to say to everybody, if you have sort of a code in your email address, as you ask a question, if you would be willing, give us a real first name and where you're from, it would make it a little more interesting. Mark says, why do Neanderthal string proponents say the weaving is, quote, mathematical?
I can answer, and then Hugh, I'm sure, can answer as well. But it's essentially the idea that when you look at the weave, you take a fiber and you would weave it either clockwise or counterclockwise. I think it was initially counterclockwise. That's called an S-twist. And so there was like two fibers twisted that way, and then that forms like a larger fibril that then is weaved with other larger fibrils in the clockwise direction, which is called a Z-twist. And so the idea is that you're starting with units that you're combining those units into larger units that are being combined into larger units to form, the fiber itself. And then the idea would be, well, that fiber is then considered to be foundational technology that can be used to make things like mats and nets and baskets and all kinds of other structures. And that again involves, quote unquote, combining these components in various ways to produce these different kinds of technologies. And so that's why they would argue it's mathematical. I wasn't compelled with that argument when I read the paper, even if I, regardless of my worldview, I wouldn't have been all that compelled. They also try to make the argument that this is also the same kind of structure that is found in language, where language have words that are combined to make sentences, that are combined to make paragraphs, blah, yada, yada, yada. And so they argue, well, this is, fibers combined to make yarns, combined to make cords, combined to make the larger fiber, right? And so they argue it's the same kind of hierarchical structure where they claim, well, it's the finite that then that can be combined in a near infinite number of ways to create infinite possibilities. And so they argue that is endemic in mathematical reasoning and it's endemic in language. That's the argument that they're trying to make. I wasn't personally very persuaded by that, but that's the argument that they made.
Yeah, and we look at what birds do with nests. They actually make quite a sophisticated basket. And I would argue it's not mathematics. They just simply figure out by trial and error which basket is stronger. And likewise, this weave we saw there, it's not a blanket, it's not a basket, it's just 1 millimeter, and it's just one piece of one of the fibers that they found. And so it could be completely accidental, or it could be like with birds. They figure out, okay, if I weave it this way, it's a stronger weave and more useful. So it may have nothing to do with mathematics at all. And yeah, I mean, I've found birds' nests that have the strength of something that we humans would make with a basket. So it's like, let's give more credit to the birds than we give to this particular piece of string.
And then kind of to build off of the question that Mark asked, and I really hate to bring this point up, to be quite frank, but I think it's worth bringing to bear. And that I think when it comes to certain areas in physical anthropology, particularly involving questions about Neanderthal behavioral capability, those questions are always intertwined with questions about whether or not human beings are exceptional. And I can tell you that from my experience, that people in the academy, particularly in anthropology or in the humanities, find the idea of human exceptionalism to be absolutely distasteful. It's almost as if they've got to spit after they say it to get that taste out of their mouth. I mean, in fact, there are people that would argue that if you say that human beings are exceptional, you are committing statements of speciesism, and that to them is almost worse than racism. And so there's a strong distaste of this idea of human exceptionalism. And as a result of that, there are people, for philosophical reasons, that are motivated to do anything they can to elevate Neanderthals to the same category as human beings. And that way now Neanderthals are exceptional, they're like us, and that human beings are no different than any other hominid. There's nothing exceptional about us. There's a very strong philosophical commitment to that. And in fact, you even see language used like you would see in race theory, where they would argue that to view Neanderthals as being inferior is, again, the same mentality that shaped racism, among human beings. And, again, so that you're almost akin to a racist to actually evaluate the evidence objectively when it comes to Neanderthal capabilities. So I can literally pick up a paper and look at the author list without the title or looking at the abstract, and I can tell you what the conclusion is going to be about whether or not Neanderthals had certain capabilities. Now, to be fair, there are other anthropologists that are working in this area that actually are fair and objective, who really evaluate the evidence as the evidence properly leads. So it's not to say that everybody in anthropology is like this, or everybody working in Neanderthal behavior is like this. There are fair-minded people. And when you read those papers, they tend to be, on balance, questioning Neanderthals' advanced cognitive abilities, and they tend to be sympathetic to the idea of human exceptionalism. Anyway, just that's worth bringing to bear. I hate to bring up that point because it feels, again, like I'm uncomfortable claiming that there's that kind of bias within a scientific community, but in my experience, it seems to be the case.
Thank you, Fuzz. This question is from Yuvan. He says, does the findings of the existence of 4 to 7% of Neanderthal genes in humans really pinpoint to interbreeding? Humans also have homology with other organisms like zebrafish, 70%, so it's not necessary we interbred with Neanderthals.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really wish that Sue Dykes was here with us, because Sue and I agreed on enormous amounts when it came to how we viewed anthropology in light of the RTB creation model. But she was far more skeptical about the claims of Neanderthal interbreeding than I happen to be. And so in the chapter in her book, or one of the chapters in not her book, but the book that she and AJ and I did on evolution, she actually lays out a case for why she questions the Neanderthal interbreeding claim. And so that book, by the way, should be available in October of this year. But who knows? I mean, given everything that's going on right now with, the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be decisions to delay the book, but it's on target right now to be available in October. So it'd be a marketing decision or something if it was delayed. So I would really encourage you to get the book and to read Sue's chapters, because they are absolutely just phenomenal. As much as I love AJ and as much as I'd like to pat myself on the back, I think the chapters from Sue are among the very best in that book. But so Sue, Yervin, Sue would actually be sympathetic to your question. I find it hard at this juncture to reject the idea that there wasn't interbreeding, just because of it's not so much the percentage or the idea of common design. I very much agree with those points, but to me, there's just certain aspects of the interbreeding or the data claim that is used to argue for interbreeding that I find hard to dismiss. So for example, there was just a paper published, and I think not this week, but the following week, I'm going to do a Facebook Live on it. But it was a study done by looking at genomes of people in Iceland, and almost half of the Icelandic population has had its genome sequenced. And there's this massive Icelandic database of genomic data. And so a team from Iceland, as well as from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany, which is the group that does all the ancient DNA work on Neanderthals, did a study where they mined this data set, and they looked at almost 30,000 genomes. And from that, they claimed to have identified basically a large proportion of Neanderthal sequences. And so what they point out in this study and there's other studies prior to this that make the same point, is that while you and I may have 2% Neanderthal DNA in our genome, that percentage seems to be consistent. From person to person, the Neanderthal sequences are actually different. And they actually identified 112,000 distinct Neanderthal sequences in those 30,000 people, those 30,000 genomes. And of that, they could reconstruct literally 50% of the Neanderthal genome from those sequences. So from those sequences alone, they could actually reconstruct the high quality genomes that they have available. And they even saw like 5%, no, that may be a little bit higher, a little bit lower, 3% of the genomics or the sequences they discovered actually correlate to Denisovans. And so this was a shock to everybody. And they actually are now claiming that either the humans in Europe were also interbreeding with the Denisovans, which is, again, kind of a radical idea, or that the Neanderthals that were interbreeding with humans were interbreeding with Denisovans. And so those interbreeding events introduced not only Neanderthal DNA, but Denisovan DNA into the genomes. So it's studies like that compel me to think that there's probably interbreeding going on, because I don't know how to explain that result in a common design model. And then on top of that, there have been recovery of human genomes from human remains that are about 40,000 years in age. And there's like 4 or 5 studies, independent studies, that have done this. And you actually see a higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA in those genomes, on the order of 10 to 15%. And the Neanderthal sequences are more contiguous, which is what you would expect for a 40,000-year-old specimen versus somebody that's contemporary. And the only way to explain that, again, is that that's very close to the time of interbreeding. Now something that's really interesting is that there are what are called Neanderthal deserts in the human genome. That is, that there are massive regions in the human genome where there's no Neanderthal DNA that contributes whatsoever. It's only certain regions. And in this latest study, what these researchers actually showed is that where you actually see Neanderthal sequences in the genome are regions are where they have absolutely no consequence in terms of our biology. Any region where a Neanderthal would have contributed to the human genome, those regions are missing, where they would have had any kind of biological significance. So what that is saying is that it probably means that there were these protective mechanisms in place that prevented Neanderthal DNA from fundamentally altering the human Neanderthal hybrid. That even though there was a Neanderthal contribution, there were protective mechanisms in place that actually retained the genetic components of that hybrid that made it far more human-like in terms of its phenotype than it may have actually been in terms of its genotype. So that's something else that's coming out of this study that was just published in Nature. This past week. So interesting stuff. So that's why I would hold to interbreeding. But Sue in her chapter makes some really good points, not so much about these studies, but rather fundamentally how the methodology is deployed to identify Neanderthal contributions in the human genome. And she actually thinks that the methodology is inherently flawed and is structured in such a way to actually detect sequences and attribute them to Neanderthals when in fact they're not legitimately attributable to Neanderthal DNA. And so that's something that I've read Sue's arguments and I find it hard to disagree with her. Let me put it that way. And so I wish Sue was here to speak for herself, because I understand her arguments and I find it hard to disagree with it. So I think she's making a really good point. But I think to go down the path that Sue's going down is you've got to really difficult row to hoe, because I don't know of anybody else who's making the claims that Sue is making. I don't know of anybody else that is working in this area that are making comparable claims. And so I think what you're doing is, in terms of apologetics, you're fighting, you're fighting multiple battles and so to me, I would much rather say, okay, let's just simply understand why people are arguing for Neanderthal interbreeding. Let's just, for the sake of argument, take it at face value. And then once we do that, then we can ask the question, is this going to fundamentally challenge the idea of human exceptionalism? Does it fundamentally raise such profound theological problems that our creation model is in jeopardy? And I think the answer to those questions is no. I think there's good theological and biblical responses to the, even if Neanderthals and humans actually did interbreed. I don't think it undermines our creation model in any way, shape, or form substantially. Now, one other point to you, and then sorry, I'm going on and on yammering, but one other point that I think brings to bear that favors Sue's position, and that is the population sizes of humans as they were migrating into Europe were very, very small. And we know that Neanderthals had very small insular populations as well, from comparing Neanderthal genomes with another, which means to me, it's highly unlikely that you're going to see humans and Neanderthals encountering each other. So on that basis alone, I think there's reasons to be skeptical if interbreeding happened. So that actually is something that counts in favor of Sue's position. Hugh, I'm sorry. I
was just going to make the point. I was present when you and Sue were having a friendly debate in this issue. And what I heard is that you were 80% persuaded that the interbreeding was real. And she said, well, I'm at the opposite, and I'm only 20% persuaded. But the point I'd like to make is that this is really not that material theologically, that we had reasons to believe can be theologically neutral on this point. And that's because, the Bible tells us that God put the image of God within us. And the Bible is very clear that God has a supernatural enemy, Satan and his band of demons. And when you look at the book of Leviticus, the strongest injunctions you see in Leviticus are the commands to avoid bestiality. Very strong statements there. And so it's quite clear that God is intent on preserving the image of God. And you just brought out the evidences, Fuzz, that if you actually take this interbreeding as real, where you see the pieces of Neanderthal genome, it's not going to impact the image of God, because what it does impact are things that are immaterial. And so we shouldn't be surprised as Christians that bestiality happens. We're sinners. Bestiality happens to this day. And I think you make an excellent point too. If this is real, the level of bestiality, this came out in some of the papers, the level of bestiality to explain this is so low, it indicates that this was a major taboo at that time, and is likely lower than the level of bestiality we see being expressed in modern times. And so we shouldn't be surprised as Christians that there are supernatural forces trying to target the destruction of the image of God, but we should also be impressed that indeed, if this is real, evidently God has ensured that the image of God is preserved. So on that basis, we could go either way on this case, because a lot of atheists who are kind of attacking our origins model actually think that if this Neanderthal interbreeding is real, that our model is toast. It's not toast at all. It's fact, we would anticipate that we would expect that there would be attempts by the evil one to damage the image of God. Okay, Ross, back to you.
Okay, this one's from David E. This is a question I think both of you could answer, but it seems more like Fuzz. Genesis 2:7 says, "Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground, and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being." Could the word, quote, dust have been chosen to represent the smallest particle known at the time, and that it really could have consisted of elements on Earth and also possibly pre-existing DNA found in nature? Could God have made man different in kind and degree, but using pre-existing DNA as building blocks, modifying it as needed to accomplish his purposes? This would explain why we share so much similarity to the animal kingdom, and would be in addition to God reusing previously used design concepts.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer from my perspective is that that's a really good point that's being raised by David, and I would largely agree with it. You know, to me, I don't know that God necessarily would have had to physically use DNA from the dust of the earth to create human beings, but I would maybe modify David's point a little bit and just simply saying that you've got this, you know, these design templates, these genetic archetypes that God has designed and created, and that God could have, you know, varied the archetypes to create distinct types of organisms. And so as part of the creation of humanity would be to create, you know, human beings with a shared archetype with other animals, but also to make, to modify that archetype to allow human beings to be genetically distinct and unique and exceptional. So that, you know, it's interesting to me, like in Genesis 2:19, it speaks about the animals, the birds, and the beasts of the field being made, or beasts of the earth being made from the dust of the earth as well. So we are made from the same stuff as the animals. So you would expect there to be shared properties that we would have, biological properties with animals, because of that Genesis 2:7 and 2:19. But what's different is in Genesis 2:7, human beings receive the breath of life, and the animals don't receive the breath of life. And so I think what really distinguishes us is the image of God, which is what I take the breath of life to be in that passage. But you would expect reasonably there to be biological similarities. So I would very much agree with David's point.
Hugh, do you want to comment on that, or do you want me to go to the next question?
Oh, well, my professor, Carl Sagan, I had him for a week's course, and he said, we're all stardust. And that is true, but it does take someone who's super intelligent to figure out what pieces of that dust to put together to make a human being.
Good. Here's a question from Warren and Nancy. How do theistic evolutionists describe Neanderthals in relation to Adam and Eve / humans? What do they say makes the difference?
Gosh, that's a good question. And I may need Hugh to help me here, because I've heard a pretty wide range of views from theistic evolutionists when it comes to Neanderthals, just in the same way that you see a wide range of views on the historicity of Adam among theistic evolutionists. The same is true with Neanderthals, all the way from, you know, they were people would share similar views to ours, that they lack the cognitive ability of humans. Others would say that they were maybe kind of intermediate in terms of their cognitive abilities, from somewhere between a brute but not quite human. Others would say that they were just like us. I think many theistic evolutionists would see the evidence for interbreeding as clear evidence that humans and Neanderthals must have shared a common ancestor. It must have one time arisen out of a shared population group. Those are kind of the range of views that you see. I don't know that I would say that there's very many TE people that I've ever encountered that would adopt kind of the young earth posture that Neanderthals were just were us. That's kind of the young earth position. So yeah, the range of views that you see among evolutionary biologists in general for Neanderthals and their relationship to humans is pretty much the range of views I've seen among TE people. Hugh, I don't know if you'd like to help.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, we have a fairly tight range of views on the Neanderthals and humans at Reasons to Believe. I think you expressed the full range with your description of where you and Sue Dykes differ, but that's about it. Whereas in the theistic evolution community, and even in the evolutionary creationism community, there's a broad spectrum of views. And so you can't put them all in one pigeonhole. There's a whole spectrum of positions that they take.
Very good. This next question is from George. Dr. Rana, isn't it true that roughly speaking at around 100 to 150,000 years ago, there was an explosion of sociological growth and the development of civilization that indicates the start of modern humanity? If I recall correctly, Dr. Rana had suggested that the origin of symbolism could have originated around the time as was reflective in unique cave art. I'm not sure if that is when we also begin to see evidence of modern day sized human skulls.
Yeah, you know, one of the big differences between the first edition of Who Was Adam and the second edition was the discovery of cave art in Asia. And we're continuing to make cave art discoveries in Asia. In fact, just recently, a team reported a mural on a wall, cave art wall, that they interpreted as being a depiction of an ancient mythology. And they argue that this is the very first evidence of storytelling that's depicted within the cave art. But that cave art that you see in Asia, and it's a number of sites now throughout Asia, it is essentially as old, if not older, than the cave art in Europe, and it's identical in terms of its style and quality. It's essentially indistinguishable, which now means that humans must have had the ability to make art before they even began to migrate out of Africa. That this is not something that emerged in Europe and then spread through culture to different parts of the world. This is something that was endemic in humans before we even began to migrate, began our migration around the world. And there is a paleolinguist by the name of Miyagawa, who's at MIT, who wrote an interesting paper a couple of years ago where he argued that what you're seeing actually in cave art in Europe, and this would probably be true as well in Asia, though nobody's done the work to demonstrate this, is that it actually is the cave art is actually a multimodal form of symbolism. So it's not just simply the art itself, but the art was actually depicted in regions of the cave where the artists were taking advantage of the acoustical properties of the cave. So where they were depicting like large herds of bison, you could actually go into that region of the cave and make certain sounds, and the acoustics in the cave would create the sense of a thundering herd. And so, or they would depict large cats in areas of the cave where the acoustical features made it extremely quiet. And so this was a multi-sensory experience that these artists were creating. And he points out that there's sand art that has been discovered in Africa that dates around 70-some thousand years in age, that also shows this same combination of art and acoustical properties. And so he argues that, well, the sand diverged from the main human trunk at about 125,000 years ago, and at least according to the genetic data, which means that if the San are doing the same thing artistically as you see in Europe and arguably in Asia, that means that this capability must have existed at the time that human beings came into existence. And the time that you see the globularity of the human skull emerging is about 130,000 years ago. It's a crude guess based on a sparse fossil record, but that's about where it appears to have. And that's also where you are beginning to see a flickering of evidence for symbolism at about that window of time. There's a report of the oldest cave drawing, or the oldest art that are actually in caves in South Africa that date close to 80,000 years in age. So to me, it's a really wonderful convergence of data that says this capacity for symbolism seems to be present really at the onset that modern humans appear. There's a great book. I can never remember the name of the book, but it's written by a paleontologist or a paleoanthropologist by the name of Genevieve Van Peltzinger, and I can never remember the name of the book, but I'll try to dig it up here. But anyway, she actually argues that you see evidence for for writing in the caves in Europe and in Asia as well. There are these symbols that show up in the cave that most people overlook because of the art. And she's identified over 30 symbols that show up consistently in the cave art time and time and time again. And she actually thinks this was the very first alphabet or a proto-alphabet. And so she's also arguing that this must have been a capability that humans had even before we began to migrate out of Africa. And she actually is of the opinion that when modern humans appear, they were fundamentally just like we are today. There was no difference. So there is a number of anthropologists that seem to be willing to push modern human capabilities, behaviorally modern human capabilities, to the point that we appear in the, where the anatomically modern form appears.
Very good. This is also a second part of George's question. If part of Josh Swaminathan's model is correct, could the attribute that specializes Adam and Eve from those outside of the garden be a soul that lives eternally? That is, those outside would not have eternal souls, lacking the imago Dei, such as the Nefesh. And maybe, Fuzz, you could just take a moment to comment on what Josh's model is.
Yeah, and I would invite Hugh to jump in as well. For people that don't know, Josh Swaminathan is a computational biologist. He's an MD, PhD, really bright guy at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's got a book called, the genealogical Adam, or genealogical Adam and Eve, or something like that. And, so we have been engaged in private and now increasingly public conversations with Josh about his idea. And what Josh is arguing is that, in contradistinction to RTB's view, which is a genetic Adam and Eve, where we would say that when Adam and Eve were created, that they were the genetic progenitors of all humanity, and that they were created to be genetically distinct, and that all human beings who are Adam and Eve's descendants bear that genetic fingerprint. Whereas Josh is arguing that Adam and Eve were actually our genealogical ancestors, not necessarily our genetic ancestors. And what he's doing is he's tapped into a study that was published in Nature in 2014 that he's continued to do additional work on. And essentially what happens is, as you go back in time, the number of people that you could count as your genealogical ancestors swells exponentially, right? So you have a mother and a father, you have 4 grandparents, you have 8 great-grandparents, and suddenly, as you go back in time, you've got this exponential explosion in the number of people that are your ancestors. But as you go back in time, the human population was smaller and smaller. So eventually you reach a point where everybody that is alive at one particular point in history who has any descendants that are alive today would essentially be the genealogical ancestors to everybody alive today, right? And so it's not a unique pair of individuals, but it's a population. And Josh is arguing that within that population, there literally would have been a man and a woman that would have been a couple that would be the genealogical ancestors of everybody alive today. And so that the work that was done in Nature showed that this went back about 3,000 years ago. And what Josh then has done is he said, well, what happens at 1 AD? What happens at 3,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago? And he shows that in all 3 models, you go back to a point where you'd have a genealogical pair that could give rise to everybody. But it's important that that's not a unique pair of individuals, but rather it would be an arbitrary pair that you would select out of that population. I'm frankly still not clear if the genealogical pair at 6,000 years ago would be the same that you would have it for 1 AD for people alive today. So I'm not even sure if you have the same genealogical Adam necessarily. So in other words, it becomes, Josh is arguing that depending on your preference, your theological preference, you can have a historical Adam and Eve if you adopt a genealogical approach, and you can place that historical Adam and Eve anywhere that you feel you need to, theologically speaking. So he doesn't actually embrace any particular position at all, other than to say, look, here's a way that you can have a historical Adam and Eve if you approach the question genealogically, not genetically. So I think he's making a very interesting contribution to the conversation. I think scientifically he's on solid ground. To me, my fundamental problem is the problem that the questioner alludes to, and that is, okay, you've got humans that would have been in existence with quote unquote Adam and Eve at the same time, who would not be declared to be image bearers, but would be biologically and behaviorally indistinct from Adam and Eve. Moreover, you would also have humans that would precede Adam and Eve that would again be biologically indistinct. And so what do you do with them? And that there would be points in time in human history where there would be people alive on the planet who would not be in Adam. And so we all are in Adam now by virtue of the fact of playing with the genealogies to the point where we can get that pair that everybody would give rise to. But then there would be points in time in history prior to when we are alive today, where there would be people that wouldn't be in Adam. And so what do you do with that? And so to me, that's the theological issue that I struggle with Josh's model. And Hugh, I'd like to, give you a chance to weigh in.
Well, I'm agreeing with you, Fuzz. And the mathematical probability that you would get the same atom at different start points is extremely tiny. So far more likely that you're going to get a different Adam and Eve, depending whether you trace back from this date or the year 0 or Abraham's date. So that to me is a fundamental weakness. But I also agree that you got other really major theological issues with that approach.
But
and I would also like to plug the fact, if you want to hear kind of a debate between Fuz Rana and Josh Swamidass, where it's critiqued by a panel, that's available at that reasons.org/Human Origins Workshop 2020. So there you can hear from Josh himself and how he responds.
But increasingly Josh is becoming a friend. So we're on very good terms with him, and I appreciate Josh's contribution to the conversation, and he's really adopting, I think, a open-handed posture, and he seems again to be genuine in what he's trying to do, and I don't see him necessarily looking to undermine other people's perspectives, but more so just saying, hey, here's an option that I'm bringing to the table. And what I do appreciate about Josh, where I think we have strong resonance, is he really is concerned about reaching people that are non-Christians with the gospel. He really seems to be strongly motivated by evangelism, much more so than I would say our friends at BioLogos. I think individually they might be committed to evangelism, but I think organizationally that's not necessarily their mission.
Well, again, I think you'll see that demeanor portrayed in the workshop that we sponsored.
Well, very good. We're 1 minute from ending. I want to apologize to all the people whose questions we didn't get answered. We only answered less than half of what's up. And I want to say, especially to Stephen Posta, who had a question from the very top, but I didn't ask it because it wasn't a Fuz Rana question and we ran out of time. So just keep asking them. Next week we'll be back and you can re-ask the same question. And Fuz, since we never get to see you, I'm wondering if you could close us in prayer.
I sure would, and I'll make an offer too, Ross. If it's not too much work for you, if you don't mind emailing me some of the questions that were posed to me that we didn't get a chance to cover, I will look at the possibility of maybe answering those questions in a Facebook Live session, because I've been doing Facebook Lives every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and so if I have some of those questions, I can definitely consider addressing them.
Well, then I just want to say to Diana, who I know can hear me, I don't know if the questions disappear when the meeting closes. So Diana, if there's some way that you can
capture the questions, that'd be
questions,
great.
Even if we just take a picture of them on our phone, whatever it takes, we can do that.
I was just thinking of that as Fuzz was saying that, and it's not straightforward, but I think I'm seeing that I'm able to shade something. So I was going to see if I can just cut and paste that into Word, but that means, Hugh, you can't end the meeting completely. You can probably just go about your business, but don't end the meeting. So I can cut and paste some of these.
Yeah, that'd be helpful for me too, rather than having our attendees repost the questions. If we can capture them, and then I'll be more than happy to answer the ones that are posed to me right off the bat next week.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Scott, by the way, for having me. It's really a treat to hang out with you guys, and just great questions. Nothing like hanging out with the group with the Paradox class. Nothing in the world like it. It's really great. So
Yep.
thanks for having me.
Well, great. Why don't you close us, Fuzz?
Sure thing. Father in heaven, it's in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that I pray, and it's through the power and the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I'm just so grateful to you for the hope that I have in you, Lord Jesus Christ. I'm grateful for your grace and your mercy in my life and the lives of all these people that are part of this class. If without you, there would just be no hope that we would really have. And so we're grateful for that. And we're grateful too that we live in a time where we have the technology that allows us to interact with each other all over the world. And so even though we have to be separated from each other, we have the technology that gives us a chance to get together, to hang out together, but also to work together, to probe the deep mysteries of
Okay. He's freeze frame right now. Could be just the connection, the internet connection. I did find a way, by the way, to capture everything and paste it into Word. So I have all the questions.
Oh, great. That's
So
very good.
helpful.
anyway, so you can go ahead and end, Hugh.
Okay.
He's in the middle of prayer. I don't know if he's coming back, but someone is texting me. It might be Fuzz. Oh, Fuzz is out.
Okay, I'll end the meeting, and
Okay.
we'll meet next week. Same time, same station. All right.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.